My goal is to get at least halfway or more through the Torah in one go. It's possible I might get through all of it. I don't know. I've never taught this one before, so I can't say for sure. But we probably will not finish it all in one night. But I don't think I have a whole hour's worth of poetry, because that's our next topic. I doubt that will take an entire hour. So my guess is whatever I don't get to tonight, I can get to next time along with poetry, and we'll still keep this to 4 weeks. But who knows? I never can tell for sure. I may not get as far as I think. But we'll get started. So last time, just as a recap, if you weren't here, or even if you were, it's just good. It's helpful to kind of know where we're at. This probably sums up what we talked about most succinctly. So here's the entire Old Testament story. So to put it really simply, in the beginning, God created everything, but then sin entered the world. And because of sin, God had to destroy everything. So Noah came along, and the flood wiped all life out on earth, and we got to start over. But still, dadgummit, sin. So Abraham gets a covenant and a new promise and a new way to tackle this thing. And Israel ultimately is a result of that, the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes. And then those 12 tribes end up in Egypt, and Moses leads them back out. And they're ready to go to the promised land physically, but they are not ready to go there spiritually. So they spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. They eventually get into the promised land, and they get some leadership established, and it's okay at first, and then it gets worse and worse and worse. And eventually the kingdom splits in two and falls apart, but God puts it back together again. And that's basically the Old Testament in a nutshell. And I put this slide up last time too. We look at the way the Old Testament's broken down into law, history, poetry, prophecy, which that's our breakdown method. The Hebrew people didn't break it down that way, but that's our breakdown method. We look at law and we say, oh, that's rules. And history, that's what you have to know so you don't repeat the past and make the same mistakes. Poetry is pretty fluffy stuff, and prophecy is the future. But we know actually to really back up and really look at not what we've labeled the Bible, but what is the Bible message really. It is, here's some instruction. Look at what these people have done. See how I constantly fix their mistakes. So praise me because I'm returning. And I think that's a really nice way to kind of sum it up. Mankind is broken and hopeless, but God is gracious and merciful. And so the whole message of the Bible is to keep our relationship with God fresh. And that's part of what we're doing right here, right now, is keeping our relationship with God fresh. There's probably nothing more, say this delicately, there's nothing that gets more stale in our daily walk than the stuff we've read over and over and over again. And Genesis is probably the most read book of the Bible, just because so many people start out like, oh, I'm going to read the Bible this year. Here we go. Got through Genesis and I'm done. Maybe next year. And next year we get through Genesis, and I don't know. So it's good to kind of come back and freshen this stuff up, I think, because really that's what it's all about. So tonight, we're going to look at the Torah, or the Pentateuch, as Wayne pointed out this morning. He's like, oh, like the Pentateuch. I'm like, yeah, that's right. The Torah, broken people reconciled to a holy God. I think that's a nice way to kind of sum the message up. So, Genesis. Oh, by the way, the book that's in your hand, I made those pretty much. Most of what I'm going to say tonight is probably in there. I don't know. I made the book at a different time than I made the presentation, and I've been in two different states of mind during that. There is a notes section on the back 2 pages, mostly just because my pages didn't come out in multiples of 4, and I had 2 blank pages, so it made sense to put note pages. But there's a good chance that there'll be some stuff I talk about tonight that's not in there, and in that case, that's a good place to jot it down. I'll try to make sure you know what those things are when I come across them, and I'll know when I get there. What's that, babe? Yeah. That's what I was getting to. Thank you for reminding me. So the purpose of the book that I gave you is partly just like it's a version of what you're getting right now, so you get to take it home with you. But also, it's just something that you could have open on the table if you decide to get the first 5 books of the Bible out and read them. There's some things in there that might make it easier for you as you go through it, or kind of remind you of the main themes, or give you a visual for something that you're reading about. And so it's just sort of a something to have in your hand when you're going through the Torah. So, Genesis. The book has the title Genesis because the word Genesis means beginning. And that's what it is. It's the beginning of time. It's the beginning of matter, which we talked about in the Apologetics series. It's the beginning of life, but also, most significantly, it's the beginning of the plan for ultimate redemption. God didn't make people and the world and time and matter and space in the universe so that he could build this perfect garden and people could live in it and never make a mistake and have it all. He knew we were going to mess it up from the very start. And he already knew what his plan of redemption would be from the very start. And the message quickly jumps to a broken people, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and eventually Abraham. And God tells Abraham, through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Because I'm going to establish my covenant with you, and I'm going to fix what you've broken. He knew we were going to do it, and that's okay. That was always part of it. The cover of your book, I chose as the cover. I didn't make that graphic. I stole it from the Bible Project guys. I think it's perfect because the very beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve sin, and there's this illustration of the serpent that the Bible says that the serpent will eventually bite the heel of the son of Eve, but he will then crush the serpent's head, And that wounded victor, which is a foretelling of Jesus, God knew that was going to happen right from the start. It was always his plan to redeem us through his own son. So that's really cool. The book of Exodus, and this is just a cap at the beginning here, just kind of hitting these quick, and then we'll go deeper into each one. The word Exodus means escape. You probably knew that already. We're escaping from Egyptian bondage, obviously, but also escaping from being a slave, not to a pharaoh, but being a slave to the worldly mindset, being a slave to wickedness, being a slave to our own desires. And you see the process of God breaking them out of that mindset and mold and breaking them into holiness. And in a lot of ways, the books of Leviticus and Numbers, which are a little bit more boring to read through, are him doing that. It's all these laws and rules and regulations, not to give them laws to follow, but to break them out of the mold of what they were in and prepare them for a different life. And so that whole worldliness. And notice I said it's mindset, and I think we have a tendency to think of, I'm worldly, like I'm desiring things of the world and I'm seeking material gain or to fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And that's true. God wants to save us from those things, but he also wants to save us from the workload, from the hopelessness. It's not all burdensome. We have a tendency to lay burdens on ourselves that God wants to relieve us from. The Jews, for the longest time, were the only people on earth to take a day off. They were bizarre among the Roman world when the Romans had taken over and had the Jews living. They were the only people who didn't work 7 days a week. And everybody thought they were lazy. They were actually labeled as lazy because they didn't work all the time. But God ordained it that way. He wanted them to take a break. He didn't want them to be the hopeless, mindless workers that the world was full of. The book of Leviticus, the word Leviticus actually means he called, and the reason why that's the name of the book is because that's the first words in the book, and you'll see that when we get to that slide, and it's in your notebook too. It says that, and God called is the very first lines of that book. The Lord called unto Moses. There it is. It was right on that slide. I just didn't look at it. The Lord called unto Moses and spake out of the tabernacle. So they get the tabernacle built at the end of the book of Genesis and Exodus. God gives them the plan for the tabernacle, and they actually get it built, but they can't go in it. Moses goes to enter the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord fills it. He can't go inside, and God calls to Moses from the tabernacle and starts giving him more instructions and starts breaking the people in, all that stuff. Numbers is called Numbers because they take a census It's 2020, so that's very appropriate. We're about to take one of those too. There's a census at the very beginning of the book, and there's a census relatively near the end. And Numbers is just a pattern of rebellion and redemption and rebellion and redemption. And there's constantly just bickering and arguing and fighting. And there's a graphic in your notebook about kind of the symmetry of the pattern of that rebellion. And then the book of Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Torah. The word Deuteronomy actually means, it literally translates to second law. This is the second time they're receiving the law. The people had received the law because Moses went up the mountain and got it and brought it down, the 10 Commandments, but also all of the other regulations, the dietary things and the behavior stuff and how to treat a servant and how to treat a spouse and all that stuff. And he had all those rules, and he'd already given it to the people. And then they decided they didn't want to go into the promised land and actually fulfill the nation that God had set up for them. So they wandered around until they all died. And now he's got a whole new generation of people that he's talking to. Because God said, if you're older than 20, you're not going in. And now that older generation has all died off, except for Caleb and Joshua and Moses. And they're right at the door of the promised land again, ready to go in. But God has already told Moses, you don't get to go in. And they climb up on this mountain, and Moses can see the promised land in the distance, which is the graphic you're seeing here. He's up on the mountain looking in the distance at the promised land, not able to go in. And he's like, guys, remember. And then he just starts talking. And that's the entire book of Deuteronomy. It's a speech, a really long speech by Moses to remind the people of all the laws and rules and regulations. Again, not as a burden, but that's what God is expecting out of his people. I put it down, this is my own words, but I call this Moses' halftime speech. It's not his halftime. He's in the last seconds of the fourth quarter of his life. But it's a halftime speech for the Israelites, because it's like, at the halftime of a football game, your coach wants to encourage you about the things you've done well, and he wants to remind you about all the stuff you didn't do well so that you go into the second half strong and really change the game. If you've been playing well, great. Keep that up. And here's some things you can do better. If you've been playing like junk, then we got a lot to work on. And that's kind of what Moses is doing here, giving them that. It's part pep talk and part plea to do better. Okay, so now, deeper dive. Let's go in. So the book of Genesis, this is a really cool concept. So this is a Hebrew phrase that is, if you were to pronounce it in Hebrew, and I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, but it's tovu vabohu. And what that means is wild and waste. At the very beginning of the book of Genesis, God identifies the world as tovu vabohu. It is wild and waste. He's spoken the universe into existence, and the world, as we know, is formless and void, is what the King James Bible always says. I've been reading ESV for a long time, but my Genesis is still KJV in my head. So the world was formless and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. That's the wild and waste. It's just like this. I always picture this just dark orb of cold water with cold, lifeless rock in underneath it. And that's the wild and waste that Genesis is talking about. Or we might translate that into unformed and uninhabited. The world is without form and void. It has not been formed into anything useful. It's just a cold, wet ball, and there's nothing in it, nothing of value. It's just rock and dirt and water. Yeah. So check this out. We're going to look at the creation in a way maybe you haven't looked at it before. I've always had trouble remembering what the order was of the days of creation, but not after I studied this out. It's like, oh, God loves symmetrical pattern. He loves balance and order and symmetry. And the days of creation have balance and order and symmetry to them too. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so on the first day of creation, God separated light and darkness. He hasn't actually created the sources of light yet. There is no sun and there are no stars. He's created the concept of light and darkness. And probably what we're meant to take away from that is he has created time, like as a concept. And then on the second day, God divides the waters from the waters. And there's a couple of layers of meaning there. One of those layers is he separates the waters above and below the firmament, which means the air. So he puts water up in the air, like clouds, and he puts water down below, like where we would expect it to be. The ocean, lakes, that kind of thing, except there's no land yet, so it's all ocean. But also in the Hebrew mindset, he's dividing the waters that are chaotic and formless and worthless from waters that will be productive, waters that you can sail on and drink from and fish out of. That's different from the wild and waste, if that makes any sense. Then on the third day, he separates the water from the land, so the dry land appears. Okay, now, I'd never bothered to think about this before, but it has perfect symmetrical pattern to the next 3 days of creation. God creates the sun and the stars, and then the water wildlife, as I'm choosing to call it, and then the land wildlife and human beings. And look, everything on the left side, the first 3 days, are the unformed part. God is forming the world. And everything on the right-hand side, the second 3 days, is creating what will inhabit the world he created on the first 3 days. So the sun and stars dwell in the brackets that God created on the first day. So he made time and space and the concept of night and day for the sun and stars to live in that. And then he created waters that wildlife could live in, and then he created land that wildlife could live on. And he did the next 3 days of creation in the exact same symmetrical pattern as he did the first 3 days. I just think that's cool. And that's why it's significant to know, not only did God divide the water above the air from the water below the air, but he created water that was not chaos water. It was water that something could live in, orderly, for fish and wildlife to live in. I just think that's really cool. You'll see this slide again when we get to Exodus, but I'll save that for Exodus. A couple other cool things to pull out of the book of Genesis, and this is in your book already. One of the pages has this on there. Adam, what we say, or Adam, maybe is a more appropriate way to put it. You notice there's actually an apostrophe in there if you're trying to like be more true to the translation, and you see the Hebrew version of Adam up there. It's a dual reference because the word Adam means human or mankind. So God named Adam man, essentially. That's my grandfather's naming system. His dog's name is Dog. If he has two dogs and one of them's black, one of them is black and one of them is Dog, right? It's almost that simple. You know, God's like, here's man. I mean, he didn't really need a name beyond man because there wasn't anybody to call him by it anyway. And later when he gets a wife, I mean, you got man and you got woman. So, hey man, what's up, woman? I don't know that that's really a good way to talk to each other, but at the time, there wasn't anybody else to talk to. So I guess that works out pretty good. Adam means human and Eve means life. The meaning is life. So Adam is a dual reference to the individual man, Adam, but also mankind. And Eve is literally and metaphorically the mother of all people. She is, in a manner of speaking, the source of life. Not that she did anything special, but God gave them the ability to multiply. And so we all owe our heritage to Eve. So, the book of Genesis contains something that a lot of people have been looking for, and it's been there all along. And I want to make sure that this is almost like a potpourri, this whole Torah thing, because I'm not trying to go through every single story in the Old Testament. That would take a while. But I am trying to kind of cherry pick some cream out of there. And one of those cream things that I stumbled upon several years ago, and I've been teaching young people about this all along, is the book of Genesis contains the meaning of life. People have, climb a mountain in Tibet somewhere, I think is what your book says in it, to find, the meaning. Or so like go find a priest in a temple in some faraway place, and maybe he's got the answer. The answer's been right in front of us all the time. The meaning of life is right here. God created man in his own image. And God blessed them. paraphrasing Genesis 1:27-30 and 2:15. So I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. God created man in his own image and blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the fish and the birds and every living thing. I've given you every plant and every tree for food." And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. What's the meaning of life? To bear God's image, to multiply, not necessarily an individual call. I'm not saying everybody has to have children, or that if you don't have children, you're not fulfilling your purpose. I'm not saying that. But as a human race, we bear God's image, we multiply, we have dominion. God made us like him. He is in charge of everything. And we are in charge of whatever God's put us in charge of. So act like it. Be mature and do your job. Like, be in charge. You're supposed to have dominion. That's your job. Have dominion over animals and plants. And, what we find, there's all this hippie junk about, human beings are the problem on this planet, that we're the ones creating all the problems, and the earth is suffering because of this burden that we've placed on it. And that's bull. The world is better with mankind in it. A forest that is completely untamed, that is left raw, is a mess. And with a little human interaction, it can be made to flourish. Fields that just grow weeds can be made to produce food and be beautiful. Mankind is necessary to tame and perfect the world that God created. He made it that way. A forest that we manage and we cut the trees out of it that don't need to be there, and we clear the brush out and we burn the leaf debris off the bottom and stuff. Man, it's beautiful. You ever driven through certain parts of our area around here, and you see really good cultivated woods? I was just driving by a place out by my mom and dad's the other day, and there's just a stand of trees on the side of their field, and you can just tell they've gone through and just really kept it nice and clear and clean. And it's a forest, but it's beautiful. It doesn't have a bunch of brushy junk growing up in it, choking all the stuff out, which, the rabbits got to have some place to live too. But we think about that, and we leave them places. The hand of man on earth, it's supposed to be there. God made us to work and keep the world. So the meaning of life is to be like God, to bear his image. And what that means is we should be like God is. God creates order from chaos. Do you know people who make chaos everywhere they go? That is not what God has intended. There are some people that are just a swirling mess. And everything around them, just, if they see a good, orderly thing, they'll just pick it apart and sow discord and make people fight. And that is not a godly way to handle things. We should be able to walk into a situation that's a mess and clean it up and make it function and make it efficient. And if we're being like God, that's what God does. We should demonstrate love and mercy, but be firm on justice. God is really quick to forgive. But by no means does that mean what we did that he had to forgive is okay. And he makes that clear. And it's good to be forgiving, but firm, because that's what God's like. Be like God, create order from chaos, demonstrate love and mercy, but be firm on justice, multiply, have dominion over the earth and its creatures, and just, maintain and steward his creation. Be respectful of what God has given us. And that's the line. I see something coming in the future where there's this concept, it's already there, that we are, we're the bad guy. We're the one that's causing all the problems. And that if we just return to some natural state, that everything will be okay. That's what we're supposed to do. And man, I worry about that. There's a lot of stuff. My wife and I, we were at Springfield some time back, and we saw there was a truck, and it had a bumper sticker on it that I took the wrong way to begin with. But it was basically saying, and you may have seen one of these before, terrible message, I was born okay the first time, is what it said. And at first, I thought that was like some sort of a stab at people swapping their gender after they're born or something. And then I realized, no, that's not it. They're talking about like, I don't need to be born again. That bumper sticker is on the same car that has all of these environmentalist messages and all of this, the whole green movement. And it's like, you can see there's a future coming where people taking care of the earth and being godless as a package deal. And wow, that's a dangerous thing. And the truth is, we need to be a good steward of God's earth and be careful with how we use it, but also know it's here for us to use. That's its whole purpose. And so there's a way to care for things and be good to the earth, and you don't have to be a tree hugging hippie to do it, but at the same time, like, there's nothing wrong with that, with caring for things, but there's a point at which it becomes too much. I probably said enough about that. Did you get my point? Okay, so the book of Genesis, if we just want to go through the whole thing, just real quick, thumbnail sketch of the timeline. This is in your book. I've got a little yellow section that's just like, and it's like everything that happens in the book of Genesis, basically. So there's the creation narrative, the 7 days of creation. God creates Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve sin. They have Cain and Abel. And, there's the murder there. Then the world is so full of wickedness that God has to flood it and start it all over. And then we have the Tower of Babel. The people who have organized on earth have now built this tower to reach the heavens, and they think a lot of themselves. And God says, that's not what I want. And so he scatters them, forces them to kind of separate and confounds their language so that they don't get to working together so much they think that they're better than God. And then God calls Abram, who he later renames Abraham, to be the nation of his special people. We get the birth of Ishmael because Abraham is impatient on waiting on God, which I understand. It did take decades between God saying, this is what I want from you, and then him actually doing it. And Abraham got impatient and thought, maybe I'm supposed to do something. Maybe not. Maybe just let God do it. And you'll see where that goes here in a minute. Ultimately, though, Isaac is born, the promised son. Isaac was God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but then provide the substitute. Then we know Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and Jacob eventually wrestles the birthright away from Esau, and he has 12 sons, who we know as the 12 tribes of Israel, or the 12 tribes that were born from Jacob. One of his sons, Joseph, is sold into slavery, and Joseph endures that slavery and all the stuff that comes with it. He does well for a little while, and then he gets knocked back down, and then he gets raised back up, and all that stuff. And then Joseph ultimately saves his whole family and the entire nation of Israel in the land of Goshen in Egypt. Okay, so, back to the story here. So you got the thumbnail sketch, and we know a little bit about kind of the creation stuff. This is kind of cool. So the flood is sort of like creation unfolding and unraveling. Another neat little snippet I just want to steal out of the book of Genesis, a little piece of cream I'm picking out of the top here. So this is kind of cool. If you think about what the flood did in comparison to creation, it's kind of a step-by-step unraveling of what God had created. God created a perfect world, and he set it up, and he pulled it away from chaos, and he created order. And then when he saw fit to destroy that world, he let the chaos go right back and then cleaned it back up one more time. So if you look at creation unspooling here, the first thing God does in the flood is the divided waters are undivided. Now, the sun and the stars, he doesn't mess with those, which is good. We'd really be in trouble if he did, right? He doesn't alter time. So day 1 and day 4 of creation are untouched. But the stuff that applies just here on earth, God starts unraveling it. So he breaks the division between the waters and the waters. The waters of the deep, the chaos water that's dangerous and that does not support life, comes up out of the fountains of the deep, and the water that was put above the firmament descends and crashes down and just destroys life. the land gets covered by water, and everything with the breath of life dies. And the Bible's not real specific about what happens to the water wildlife. I think we sometimes just kind of write it off like, oh, well, obviously fish live in water, so the flood probably was okay for them. I don't know. I would say probably a lot of that life died too. When the fountains of the deep break up, I'm going to guess a lot of that water is really hot or not oxygenated or whatever. And it probably killed a lot of the fish wildlife that lived in it too, and not to mention fresh water and salt water getting mixed up and kind of messing with stuff. So I'm sure a lot of water wildlife died in the flood as well. But God stays his hand. He literally unravels all creation and destroys everything he made. But he stops at Noah. And the Bible actually says, but God remembered Noah. Not that he forgot him, but he stayed his hand over that to keep that part of creation from getting destroyed. And then, over time, things start going back. And the water calms back down. And it starts going back where it's supposed to go. And the land gets uncovered again. And life is able to go out and multiply once more. It's kind of cool to think about it that way. That I'd never thought of it that way, but I heard it explained to me one time. Like, the flood is creation unraveling. I was like, oh, yeah, that's kind of cool. So that's kind of a cool way to think about it. And I just drew a box around the part of the creation narrative that God unravels. Probably should have put that up when I was talking about it. Another little thing I wanted to point out about the book of Genesis. So we talked about Abraham has Ishmael as well as Isaac. If you didn't know this, you probably already did. But if you didn't know this, Abraham's first son, Ishmael, God promises, I said I was going to bless Abraham's offspring, and I'm going to do that. So Ishmael's going to get blessed too, and his people will also become numerous, but those people ultimately become Muslims, the Arab people that we are having so much trouble with. That's always been a problem. Sin has massive implications over time. And so Abraham making the choice to have a child outside of the relationship that God had set up, man, that was a bummer, and that is still causing us trouble because those people eventually become Muslim people. And to this day, Muslim people, they see the Bible a lot the same way that we do in the sense like the Old Testament. They understand those stories to be true, but where we have a falling out is over the Ishmael-Isaac thing. According to the Judeo-Christian faith, Isaac was the son that was always promised by God. And when Abraham had Ishmael and then Sarah got pregnant with Isaac, Sarah's like, I think we messed up. And Abraham's like, well, let me take this to God. God, what do I do? And Abraham's like, go with what Sarah said. Really, basically, that's a paraphrased version of it, but that's basically what happens. And so we understand God's blessed son was Isaac. But to the Muslim people, they're like, no, Ishmael got born first. This is the rules. The firstborn son gets the promise, so Ishmael is the rightful heir. And they trace their caliphate leadership in the Muslim world right back to Ishmael. And it's the sons of the sons of the sons of Ishmael that are in charge of things. And that's, according to them, the way it ought to be, which, yeah, is problematic. They claim to serve the same God, but one of the things that we say about God is limitless in his power. There is only one thing God cannot do, and that's lie. He can't lie. Because when he speaks word, it becomes truth. If it hadn't been truth before, it would be truth now just because he said it. But the Muslim people don't want to limit God's power that way. So they say, well, he can even lie, which means if you're a Muslim, there's actually no guarantee that God will actually fulfill any of the promises that he gave you. You might live your whole life in service to him, and then he pull the rug out from under you at the last minute because he can change his mind if he wants to, because his words don't have to stay true, which is, man, that's a faith I wouldn't want to be a part of. Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and Esau, man, you can be hard on Jacob and be like, man, Jacob was kind of a jerk. He caught his brother in the weakest moment and stole his stuff, and then he's already stolen his birthright, and when he's ready to get his blessing, He waits until the guy leaves the house and then sneaks in behind them and steals that too. And yeah, that's true, he did. But also, Esau doesn't really seem to care about the blessing that he's received a whole lot because he's awful fast and loose with it. He's willing to sell his birthright for soup. Like, really? Could you not walk like 10 more steps to your own house or whatever and just go forage for berries or something? I mean, come on, man. Really? Esau, if you read the Bible, it says about him, he's not a real respectable dude. And ultimately, his children bear that out because he gives birth to the Edomites, which also cause Israel a lot of problems. You find out Edom is a constant problem for them. It's one of those nations they never really destroy and get rid of. And in the time when the kingdom splits, they're kind of rooting for the group that comes in and wipes out Israel, and they move into the promised land when the Israelites get scattered. They kind of move in and start taking over and setting up shop, and they're kind of bummers. If we follow that family tree on down to Jacob, just in case you weren't clear on how this whole family tree works, Jacob has all these sons, all 12 of them, and we know from Jesus' lineage, the New Testament tells us, all those books of the New Testament and the Old Testament too that you don't like to read, Arphaxad begat Gad and Gad begat, whatever, I don't know. Those are really boring to read, but they're there for a reason because we can trace the lineage of Jesus back. Jesus is born out of the tribe of Judah, which is why we sing those songs like, Hail, Hail, Lion of Judah, Hail, Hail, Lion of Judah. Yeah, this is Jesus' heritage. That's what we're talking about. This is interesting. If you go through the Bible and pay attention to the stories all the way through, Judah, which right away, he has an issue. One of his sons dies, and his son's wife doesn't have anybody to be with her. Typically, the other sons will kind of take a wife in, not necessarily to have children through her, but to just make sure that she's taken care of. But she was totally rejected. Nobody was going to take care of her. So she hatched this plan to sit outside the gates of a city and appear as a prostitute. And she gets Judah involved in this whole thing, and he sleeps with her, and he lies about it and tries to cover it up and all this stuff. Well, this whole kind of prostitute relationship is part of the lineage of Jesus. And further on down that lineage is Rahab, who you may remember was a prostitute in Jericho. And when they went to tear down the walls, she's like, will you please remember me when you tear down the walls and destroy the city and don't destroy me and my family? And they're like, yeah. And if you read between the lines there and look later in the Bible, we find she married into Israel to a guy named Salmon, and they had children. And they are from the line of Judah and Tamar. And ultimately, that line will produce David. And David will take Bathsheba as a wife by murdering her husband and stealing her. And the child that they have, their first child dies, but the child that they have will eventually be the lineage of Jesus, which is fascinating. God takes broken people, and God could have made sure there was a clean family tree from the tribes of Israel all the way down to Jesus. And he chose not to do that. He chose some of the most scandalous relationships to bear his own son into this world. That's not an accident. That's on purpose. We're supposed to understand no matter how bad we mess up, God can fix it. Bookends of Genesis here. So to finish up the story. By the way, one last thing I wanted to say about the line of Jesus. It's not Mary that is related to the tribes of Israel. She actually bore Jesus. And he, I guess, must have bore her blood. If we got Jesus' DNA, I'm going to assume Mary's is in there. God's the other half. But I'm going to assume Mary's in there. Jesus actually didn't have a drop of Judah's blood in him. But he's still, by God's own word, from the line of Judah. He's an adopted kid. He's a stepchild. And yet, that's the way God chose to bring him into this world, as a stepchild to Israel. What a cool thing that God did. God absolutely honors stepchildren and adopted children and all that stuff. We're all adopted children of God, and he thinks that's great. So the bookends of Genesis, just to sum Genesis up. I knew I wasn't going to make it through the Torah in one night. On the beginning of Genesis, it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. Serpent, God's talking to the serpent. Between your offspring and her offspring, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. It's a foretelling of Jesus. The very beginning of Genesis tells us that Jesus is coming. And the very end of Genesis gives us a very good story about what his life is going to be like. Because Jacob, the last character in Genesis, is an archetype of Jesus. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Joseph is born to Jacob, a favored son. Of all of his sons, he just dotes on Joseph. So Joseph is this highly favored son, but his own brothers absolutely hate him. And his brothers seek to kill and destroy him. And in that act of destruction, they put him in the position he needs to be in to turn right around and save them all from their situation. If they hadn't sold Joseph into slavery, they wouldn't have had Joseph to bail them out when the famine came. And isn't that just Jesus' story, really, in different words? Born a favored son of his father, hated by his own brethren, and put up to be tortured and killed. But by us torturing and killing him, he gets to do what he came to do, which is redeem us from our sin. Isn't that cool? So Joseph is absolutely an archetype of Jesus, which is really cool. Okay, book of Exodus. I've only got about 15 minutes here, but that's okay. The basic story of Exodus is right here. Moses, is born. His mama has to put him in a basket and send him down the river because they've been ordered to kill all of the male Hebrew children. But we're going to spare Moses. So we put him in a basket and send him downriver. He gets picked up by Pharaoh's daughter, and he ends up getting taken care of by his own mom. But as he grows up in Pharaoh's house, he goes on to kill an Egyptian, and then he runs off into the desert to escape whatever the Egyptians might do to him. And as a shepherd, he's out one day and he sees a burning bush out in the distance, and he goes up to it because that's weird. A bush that's burning and is not being consumed. And God says, I want you to go back to Egypt where you came from, and I want you to set my people free. And so he does. He goes to Egypt, and he unleashes the 10 plagues on them. God gives him the ability to do that. And then ultimately when they finally leave, they get to the Red Sea where all hope seems lost, and then God miraculously parts the waters and they go through. They eventually get to Mount Sinai where they receive the 10 commandments and all that stuff. Moses comes down the mountain, sees the golden calf, gets real mad, breaks the 10 commandments. Did you know? Not only did he break the 10 commandments, did you read what he does to the calf? He busts it up, grinds it up into dust, and puts it in water and makes them drink it. Ha ha! I got to remember that one. That's a torture now. I mean, take all your precious gold, make this ugly thing with it. I'm going to make you drink it and eliminate it later and bury it outside the camp. We don't need to get into the details there. He also gets the tabernacle blueprints, which will become important for the book of Leviticus because they got to get that tabernacle built and get all the rules so that they can have Congress with God. Okay, so here's something cool. And this is in your book. It's got all these laid out. I almost did not put this in my presentation. And then I thought, I don't know. This is theoretical. What I'm about to show you is how God disassembled Egypt's gods through his plagues. Now, the Bible doesn't specifically say each of these details. We're matching up what we know about history with what we know from the Bible and putting two and two together. And I almost didn't include it. There's three reasons I did. One was I just felt compelled to do it. I just felt like I couldn't leave it out. And I think that was God saying, no, it's okay, go ahead and leave it in. Two, when I was reading Read Scripture, the Read Scripture app, I'm going to pull my phone out here and look at an image because I saved it. Because I was like, oh, that's so cool. Because I've always thought, well, God was taking down the Egyptian gods, but it doesn't actually say that in Exodus, and it doesn't. But it does say it in Numbers. In the book of Numbers, it's either chapter 31 or 32. I've snapped the verse, but I can't tell because I got it from Read Scripture and it doesn't say at the top if it's 33. Oh, sorry, it's either 33 or 34. Verse 4, While the Egyptians were burying their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them, on their gods also the Lord executed judgment. So the Bible does say God was specifically going after the gods of Egypt. So I'm going to show you this. That was right there. Once again, I should just read my own slides. I made these. You would think I would know. I've never taught this before. So this is really, really cool. The first plague is when Moses turns the Nile to blood. Now, the Nile to the Egyptians was a holy thing, like it was a god in itself. So Happy, which is the blue dude, which makes sense. If it's going to be the god of the Nile, you'd make him blue, I guess, because water's blue. Happy was the god of the Nile, and I'm guessing he's got that little jug in his hand because he's carrying water around. I don't know that for sure, but that seems logical. Khnum, which is the god of the source of the Nile, and Osiris's blood was supposed to be the Nile. Now, how that works out, how one god is the Nile, but another god is the source of the Nile, and another god's blood is the Nile, you'd have to ask an Egyptian. I don't get how that works. Their pantheon does not make sense to me. But God took them all down by turning that Nile to real blood. Take that, Osiris. Plague 2 was frogs. I find this really cool. Hecht was the goddess of fertility and water, and she was depicted as having the head of a frog. God said, oh, you have a god of frogs. That's cool. Here's some frogs. How you like that? Pretty awesome, right? And the Bible goes on to really talk about how bad that frog plague is. It's like if you opened a drawer, frogs would hop out. If you turned down your bed, frogs would hop out. When you got out your kneading bowl to knead bread, there were frogs in the bowl. And it's like, I think frogs were pretty cool. Like, they're kind of cute and stuff. But, man, not like that. I like frogs, okay. I don't want to share my bed with a frog. I do not want to open my microwave and have frogs pop out. It reminds me of that scene in E.T. where they're getting ready to dissect the frogs and they set them all free. Maybe a reference that's too old for a lot of people in the room, but I like it. It's good. I think that's cool that it was a frog god. Take that, frog god. The plague of lice might have challenged Geb, which was the god of the earth, and also the grandson of the creator god, supposedly, the quote-unquote creator god. So God was kind of working up the line of the pantheon of gods here. I'm guessing God of Earth is a big job. He's got a bird on his head, though, so. The plague 4 was the plague of flies. Khepri was the god of insects, because you got to have a god for everything. And it was often depicted as having a beetle's head, but was actually in charge of, and on the list of things that Khepri was in charge of, flies is one of them. So it's like, oh, you've got a god in charge of flies. Well, pray to him, because these flies are everywhere. Oh, is he not listening? Is he not making them go away? That's because he's not real. So how about that? Also, that particular god, the bugs that he was in charge of were the ones who actually hauled the sun up in the morning. I guess they saw dung beetles working, is my guess. Like, rolling the sun up in the morning. I'm guessing that's why he has a beetle head. I think that's pretty cool. The death of all cattle. The goddess Hathor was the goddess of love and protection. Where are you now? Because our cattle are all dead. And also, she had often depicted as a cow or the head of a cow, which is pretty cool. Isis was the target of Plague 6, most likely, because she was the goddess of medicine and the goddess of peace, two things that you feel are sorely lacking when you are covered from head to toe with boils. Okay, so Nut and Shoe are both depicted here. I don't know who the green dude is. And I actually looked to try to figure out, who is the green dude? And I've seen several different depictions of the god Nut and Shoe depicted. And there's usually a person at the bottom. They're not always green, but I cannot for the life of me figure out who that's supposed to be. If that's supposed to be just like Egyptian people, or I don't know. But Nut was the goddess of the sky, which you see her doing that cheerleading thing that the girls always learn to do when they're like 8 and then they want to do it all over the place. She's doing that thing over Shu, the god of wind of air. And you notice he's kind of helping to hold her up because I guess the wind holds up the sky or something. I guess that might make sense. So fiery hail, that would be their fault. They should have stopped that, and they didn't. And the green guy suffered as a result of it. I guess. I don't know. Plague 8 was a plague of locusts. And Neper and Nepri, a male and female, were the gods and goddess of grain. Now, that picture is the best one I can find. Neper and Nepri, I guess, are sort of interchangeable. It could be one or the other or both, and take that for what you will. But obviously locusts would have devoured all their grain, so taking that one down. Probably you've heard of Ra before, even if you don't know anything about Egyptian gods. I guarantee you've almost certainly heard of Ra, because that's the one that most people were most keen to observe in their religious practices was Ra. Ra was the god of the sun. I guess he needed a beetle to help him in the morning to get the sun up in the sky. But Ra was the god of the sun, and obviously the plague of darkness really takes a chunk out of Ra. Darkness that could be felt, the Bible says. Not just dark, like the lights went out, but an oppressive darkness that was like all the claustrophobic people in the room, just like, ooh, darkness just closing in on you from every direction and you cannot get away from it. Light a candle and you don't see it. Where are you, Ra? I don't know. I'm calling, but I don't hear him. I keep picturing Elijah and the prophets of Baal, like, pray harder, cut yourself with stones more, keep praying to your God. Maybe he'll hear you. You know what? I bet your God's asleep. If you just yell a little louder and dance around a little more and cut and scream a little more, maybe your God will answer you. Oh, he didn't answer you, huh? Lord, instant, right? And then, of course, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, that affected Pharaoh. It hit Pharaoh right in the heart, because that got his own son. He himself claimed to be a god. The Pharaoh was supposed to be a god. And for somebody to be able to take Pharaoh down a notch, this spoke a very powerful message to the Egyptian people about their gods and about their whole system. And God was not only disassembling the slavery and letting them get out of Egypt, he was disassembling everything they'd been sitting around for 400 years. You spend 400 years in captivity to a group of people, some of their lifestyle is going to get on you. And when God removed them from Egypt, he wanted to make it absolutely clear, not one of these gods is real. I am the real God, and I will prove it to you, and I will prove it to them. Now, the Egyptians apparently went right back to worshiping those gods when the Egyptians left. When the Israelis left, but when the Israelites knew better. Not to mention he delivers them right through the Red Sea on their way out. You will also find in the book of Exodus a really detailed description of the tabernacle. I'm not going to go all the way through this. For one thing, I'm down to just a couple of minutes of time. But also, it's in your book, and you can go through it and look at it. Some things to point out. The tabernacle itself is made up of 3 big parts. So the first part is just this huge kind of fenced-in area, and you would bring your sacrifices in here, and that's where the priests would perform all the rituals and slaughter the sacrifice and put the blood on the altars and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the actual tent itself that only the priests are going to really enter into. And when you go in there, you see the golden candlestick, the menorah there. And then on the other side of the candlestick, there's the table of shewbread. When people would bring grain offerings and stuff, that they'd put it there, and then that's where the priests ate. The priests actually went into that holy place and ate in there. And then if you go in even deeper, which they typically didn't do, and that's just the high priest that does that, they go into this Holy of Holies space where the Ark of the Covenant is kept. And that's, to their mind, the actual dwelling place of God. Not that God needs 2 beds and 3 baths or anything, but if there's a physical location where God is, that's it. It's in the Holy of Holies, in the very most holy place in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant is being kept. And that's where the high priest goes and meets with God. Interestingly, and we'll look at this more a little bit later, but I was watching this video, and this is really cool. I've talked to several people about this since I watched it because it just blew my mind. Never thought of it this way. But we'll probably bring it up later in this series at some point, and I'll show you the video. But when the tabernacle was built, and then ultimately it gets replaced by the temple, but God had very specific rules about how the tabernacle was to be set up. Anytime they stopped walking and set up the tabernacle, they always pointed the door of the tabernacle toward the east. That was part of the setup. And there's significance to that because so the Hebrew people are trying to find a way to get into God's presence. Their sin has broken their relationship with God, and they need a way to get to him, to have access to him. And the temple is that access. When God kicked Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, when they were in the garden, they had unlimited access to God. God literally walked with them through the garden. They wanted to ask God a question. Hey, God, why are whales big or something? I don't know. And God could answer that question, I guess, if they didn't have anything better to ask. I don't know what you ask. So that relationship's been broken down. Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden. When God kicked them out, the Bible is very specific about saying they were kicked out. They were west, and they got kicked out to the east. They went out of the east side of the Garden of Eden. And God protected the entrance to the garden with cherubim, these special creatures. They're kind of like multi-winged things. And God put cherubim at the gates of the garden so they couldn't go back in. When he gave them the tabernacle, the door to the tabernacle points to the east. So when you go inside the holy place, you are east, you are headed west, back in. And when you walk into the temple and you get to the Holy of Holies, the curtains that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tent, God specifically asked that they embroider cherubim on the curtains. So to go into that holy place where God is, you literally pass through two cherubim to get there. And in case the imagery didn't hit you over the head yet, the Ark of the Covenant has two cherubim on it as well, to remind you. And when you actually get in there, all around you are embroideries, and later in the temple, engravings of trees, palm trees, and cherubim all around. So when you were actually in the Holy of Holies, in the presence of God, so to speak, you walked right back into the garden, right through the cherubim, and you're standing in the midst of the trees in the presence of God. Isn't that cool? And as cool as that sounds, you're the temple of God now. And that's in you, which is really cool. Okay, that's probably a good place to stop because it's already 6 o'clock. And I was hoping I'd get through Genesis and Exodus, and I thought if I'm lucky, I'll get through Leviticus and Numbers too because there's only a couple slides on each of them. But that's okay, I'll get to that next time. What's great about the way we're stopping this is the end of talking about the Torah is talking about the Hebrew language and what they mean when they say my mind or my heart or my soul. What does that word actually mean? Which kind of gets us into almost like a poetic understanding of Hebrew, which is the perfect time to go right into the books of poetry because we can kind of explore that same concept. So that's what we'll talk about next time.